My family had worked this land for 4 generations, every inch known, every shadow understood, until one morning a single, impossibly deep footprint emerged from the mud, revealing a terrifying truth. We were not alone. The old farmhouse groans in the morning like a man stirring from a deep sleep. It's a sound I've known my whole life, same as the crow of the rooster and the low, contented rumble of the cattle waking in the pasture. Blackwood Creek Farm has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather carved it out of the wilderness with his bare hands, and every fence post, every stone in the foundation of the barn feels like a part of my own bones. The land knows me, and I know it. Every dip in the terrain, every stubborn rock in the north field, every patch of soil that holds water a little too long after a rain. I know it all. Or at least, I thought I did. That morning started like any other. The air was cool and thick with the smell of damp earth from the overnight shower, the kind of gentle rain that sinks deep and makes the corn happy. I'd had my coffee, black and strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and was heading out to check the fence line along the eastern edge of the property, the part that borders the old woods. It's a constant battle, keeping that fence mended. The deer are brazen, and every now and then a black bear will get a foolish notion and try to force its way through. I was about halfway across the lower cornfield, the stalks now high enough to brush against my shoulders, when I saw the first one. It was pressed deep into the muddy soil between 2 rows of corn, a perfect, unmistakable print, and my blood went cold. My first thought was that a trespasser had been through, maybe some kids from town looking for trouble. But this was no boot print. It wasn't human at all, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen in my 50 years of walking this land. It was long, impossibly narrow, and ended in 3 distinct, claw-like toes that had dug deep into the mud. It was shaped vaguely like a man's bare foot, if that man were a giant and his foot had been stretched on a rack. The sheer size was one thing, but it was the depth of the impression that truly unsettled me. The ground was soft, sure, but this thing was heavy. Heavier than a man. Heavier, even, than the bull I keep in the far pasture. Whatever made this print had some serious mass to it. I stood there for a long moment, the morning chorus of birds seeming to fade into a dull hum in my ears. I scanned the area. No other signs. Just this one, solitary, bizarre footprint. My practical farmer's mind tried to kick in, tried to find a rational explanation. A prank? Someone with a custom-made boot stomper? It seemed elaborate for a joke out here in the middle of nowhere. A bear walking on its hind legs for an extended period? Unlikely. The print was too defined. Too slender. Then, a few yards ahead, I saw another one, and another after that. They were laid out in a perfectly straight line, cutting directly through the corn rows, not following the natural path between them. The stride was enormous, at least 7 or 8 feet between each print. This wasn't a meandering animal. This was something with a purpose, something moving with an unnatural, efficient gait. My curiosity, now laced with a heavy dose of primal dread, got the better of me. My chore of checking the fence was forgotten. I had to see where this trail led. I started following the tracks, my own boots sinking into the mud beside the massive alien impressions. The corn stalks crowded in around me, their leaves rustling in the slight breeze, sounding like whispers I couldn't quite make out. Every snap of a twig, every flutter of a bird taking flight made my head whip around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The feeling of being watched was immense, a physical pressure on the back of my neck. The trail led me out of the cornfield and across the wide-open cattle pasture. The cows were clustered together near the trough, further away than usual, their heads up and their eyes wide and nervous. They were watching the woods, their lowing carrying a note of anxiety I'd never heard from them before. The tracks continued right through the middle of their grazing land, a straight, unswerving line of deep, 3-toed gouges in the earth. It passed within 50 yards of the old barn, a place of safety and familiarity that now seemed somehow vulnerable. The thought of whatever made these tracks being that close to my home, to my sleeping family, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The path it took was what really started to get under my skin. It seemed to be making a survey of the farm. It crossed the pasture, went over the small creek that gives the farm its name, not at the shallow crossing point I always use, but straight through a deeper section, churning up the creek bed, and then headed up towards the hay fields on the western slope. It even passed by the old, rusted-out tractor my granddad left to rust in peace a half-century ago. a landmark as familiar to me as my own reflection. It was like it was taking inventory. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on my neck. I was soaked in sweat, my jeans caked in mud to the knees. I hadn't stopped for water. I hadn't even thought about it. I was a man possessed, driven by a need to understand this violation of my world. I followed the tracks as they skirted the edge of the apple orchard. A few low-hanging branches snapped clean off, the brakes fresh and splintered. The sheer power it suggested was terrifying. Finally, the tracks led me back out into the center of the largest, most open field on the property, the 100-acre plot we use for soy. It's a vast, empty expanse, and by now the sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. I stood there, panting, shielding my eyes and looking at the line of prints stretching out before me. They just kept going, a straight, relentless path towards the setting sun. But that's when I noticed something was wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. I had been so focused on the track immediately in front of me, on putting one foot in front of the other, that I hadn't been paying attention to the bigger picture. I had followed this thing in a massive, slow loop around my entire property. The farmhouse was now visible in the distance, a small, lonely shape against the darkening tree line. I was almost back where I started, but that wasn't the part that made my stomach drop into my boots. I looked down at the last print in the long, long line. It was deep, perfectly formed in the drying mud. Then I looked back the way I came, at the hundreds of identical prints marching across the field. A single line, one set of tracks. There was no return path, no second set of prints walking alongside the first. Just the one trail, leading from the woods, on a grand tour of my farm, and ending up here. Right here. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible logic. How could something walk all this way, leaving a single line of tracks, and then just vanish? It was as if it had been plucked from the sky. I stood there, frozen in the middle of that vast, silent field, staring at the final, deep footprint at my feet. The sun had finally sunk below the horizon, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. The evening chill began to set in, and then the thought, the one, simple, terrifying thought that my brain had been refusing to form, finally broke through. The trail I had been following for hours, the one that crossed my entire property, didn't lead off into the distance. It stopped. Right behind me. My breath hitched in my throat. For a full minute, I didn't move. I didn't dare. I was a statue in the fading light, every muscle in my body locked tight. The silence of the open field was suddenly a roaring in my ears. The air, which had been cool, now felt suffocatingly heavy. My mind was a frantic scramble of denial and pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I forced my head to turn, a slow, creaking movement that felt like it took an eternity. My neck popped. I squeezed my eyes shut, then forced them open, expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. A towering beast of shadow and claw, eyes glowing in the dusk. Something. There was nothing. Just the empty field stretching out behind me, the neat rows of stubble from the last harvest fading into the deep purple shadows of the encroaching night. Nothing. The wind whispered past my ears, a cold, mocking sound. I spun around, a full circle, my boots stumbling in the soft earth. North, south, east, west. Nothing. Just my land. My empty, silent land. But it wasn't empty. My skin crawled with the certainty of it. The feeling of being watched hadn't lessened. It had intensified 1,000 times over. It was a physical presence now, a crushing weight in the air all around me. It was here. It was right here. I just couldn't see it. That was somehow worse. A monster you can see. You can fight. You can run from. But a monster that leaves tracks heavier than a bull and can stand right behind you without you seeing it? How do you fight that? How do you run from that? Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through my paralysis. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, my legs pumping, my lungs burning, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I scrambled through the soy field, across the pasture, my own footsteps a frantic, sloppy counterpoint to the deliberate, massive stride I had been following all day. The cows were still huddled together, their eyes like white saucers in the gloom, tracking my flight. They weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, into the darkness I was running from. The lights of the farmhouse were a beacon of sanity in a world that had suddenly gone mad. I burst through the back door, not even bothering with the mud on my boots, and slammed it shut, fumbling with the deadbolt until it shot home with a satisfying thud. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, sweat and terror making me shake uncontrollably. My wife, Sarah, was at the kitchen sink. She dropped a plate with a clatter, her hand flying to her mouth. "Frank? What on earth is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't answer. I just stared at her, my eyes wide, trying to pull myself together. I went through the house room by room, checking every lock on every window, pulling every curtain shut. The familiar comfort of my home felt like a flimsy cardboard box. The walls felt thin, the windows like gaping holes into the night. "Frank, you're scaring me," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she followed me into the living room. "What happened out there?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to spill it all out, the impossible footprint, the unnerving trail, the horrifying realization in the field. But the words wouldn't come. How could I say it? "Honey, there's a giant, invisible monster that spent the day touring our farm and then followed me home." I'd be on my way to a padded room before sunrise. Just a coyote, I lied, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. A big one, spooked the herd. She didn't believe me, I could see it in her eyes. She'd known me for 30 years. She knew the difference between a man who'd seen a coyote and a man who'd had his soul scraped raw with fear. But she didn't push. She just nodded, her face pale, and went to make me a cup of tea. I sat in my armchair, the one my father used to sit in, and stared at the dark windows, every reflection, every flicker of light making me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching, waiting. Hours passed. Sarah went to bed, though I knew she wasn't sleeping. I heard the floorboards creak above me as she tossed and turned. I just sat there, in the dark, a cold mug of tea on the table beside me. Outside, the wind picked up. The weather was turning. A storm was rolling in from the west, the first fat drops of rain beginning to tap against the window pane. The rain. The thought hit me like a physical blow. The rain would wash them away. All of it. The proof. The only thing that told me I wasn't losing my mind. By morning, the prints would be gone, turned back into meaningless puddles in the mud. It would be as if it never happened. And I would be alone with this knowledge. The idea was unbearable. I couldn't let that happen. Before I even knew what I was doing, I was on my feet. I went to the locked cabinet in my study and pulled out my old .30-06 hunting rifle. The familiar weight of it in my hands was a small comfort. Then I grabbed the most powerful flashlight I owned, a heavy-duty beam that could cut through the thickest night. "I'm just going to check the generator," I called up the stairs, my voice a rough whisper. "Storm's coming in." Another lie. I slipped out the back door and into the now driving rain. The wind whipped at me, tearing at my coat. The world beyond my porch was a maelstrom of blackness and noise. But I had to go back. I had to see them one more time. I had to take a picture, cast a mold, something, anything. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut, but now it was mixed with a stubborn, angry resolve. This was my farm, my home. I wouldn't be hunted on my own land. I trudged back out into the fields, the beam of my flashlight cutting a shaky tunnel through the deluge. The rain was cold, plastering my hair to my skull, but I barely noticed. My entire being was focused on that spot in the middle of the 100-acre field. It took me forever to find it again in the dark and the rain, my own tracks from earlier already turning to soup. But then my light caught it. The last print. It was filling with water, the edges already starting to soften and slump, but it was still there. An impossible gouge in the earth. I knelt beside it, my rifle held tight in one hand, my heart pounding in time with the drumming rain. I pulled out my phone, shielding it from the water, trying to get a clear picture. The flash illuminated the muddy water in the depression. And that's when I saw it. Something was in the print. Something that hadn't been there before. It was small and dark, resting at the bottom, placed with an unnatural precision right in the center of the heel. My hand trembled as I reached down, my fingers plunging into the cold, gritty water. I pulled it out and wiped the mud away. It was metal. It was old and tarnished, with a frayed piece of ribbon still attached. My blood ran cold, colder than the rain, colder than the mud. I knew what it was instantly. It was my father's silver medal, the one he got for bravery in the war. The one I kept in a locked wooden box on the top shelf of the closet in my study. The study I had been sitting in less than an hour ago. It hadn't just been behind me in the field. It had been in my house. The medal felt like a block of ice in my palm. The weight of it, the cold, familiar texture of the tarnished silver, The impossible reality of it being here, in the mud, in a monstrous footprint in the middle of a storm-swept field. My mind refused to process it. It was a glitch in the universe, a piece of a nightmare that had somehow leaked into the waking world. The box was locked. I had the only key. It was on my keychain, which was in my pocket. I fumbled for it, my fingers numb and clumsy, and there it was, the small brass key, cold and solid against my skin. No one could have opened that box. No one. My frantic dash back to the farmhouse was fueled by a new, more potent kind of terror. This wasn't just a trespasser anymore. This wasn't just some unseen creature observing from a distance. This was an invasion. It had been in my home, in my private spaces, moving through the rooms where my family slept, touching my most personal possessions. The thin walls of the house no longer felt like a flimsy defense. They felt like no defense at all. The locks were meaningless. The bolted doors were a joke. I burst back inside, dripping water and mud all over Sarah's clean floor, not caring. I didn't even bother to take off my boots as I thundered up the stairs, my heart threatening to explode. I threw open the door to my study and went straight to the closet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached up to the top shelf, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grasp the familiar contours of the carved wooden box. I brought it down, my eyes fixed on the small brass lock. It was closed, undisturbed, just as I'd left it. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought I must have been mistaken. Maybe it was a different metal. Maybe my mind, strained by fear, was playing tricks on me. With trembling hands, I unlocked the box and lifted the lid. The velvet interior was empty. The indentation where the metal had rested for 30 years was a hollow, mocking void. I sank down into my chair, the empty box in my lap, the muddy metal clutched in my fist. It knew. The thought was a whisper of ice in the chaos of my mind. It knew what that metal meant to me. It wasn't a random theft. My father was my hero. He died when I was just a boy, and that metal, that box, was my most sacred connection to him. This thing hadn't just taken an object. It had taken a piece of my soul and left it outside as a message. A calling card. A warning. But a warning of what? Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night with the rifle across my lap, watching the windows as the storm raged outside. Every creak of the old house, every rattle of a window pane in the wind, was the sound of it coming back. I was a prisoner in my own home, a cornered animal waiting for the predator to strike. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The sky was a bruised purple-gray, and a thick, unnatural fog clung to the ground, swallowing the fields and woods in a blanket of white. And the tracks were gone. I knew they would be. I forced myself to walk out into the soupy morning air, the fog so dense I could barely see the barn from the back porch. The ground was a sea of mud, all evidence of my tormentor erased by the storm. It was as if the whole thing had been a fever dream. If it weren't for the heavy, cold weight of the metal in my pocket, I might have convinced myself it was. But I knew. The land knew too. The silence was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a country morning. It was a dead, watchful silence. The birds weren't singing. The cattle were pressed up against the fence nearest the house, their breath pluming in the cold air, their eyes wide and fixed on the wall of fog. They wouldn't go out into the pasture. They sensed it. It was still out there, hidden in the mist. I had to do something. I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for an invisible entity to decide to do more than just leave cryptic warnings. I was a farmer. My life was about solving problems. A broken fence, you mend it. A sick animal, you call the vet. A pest in the fields, you deal with it. This was just another pest. A bigger, more terrifying pest than I had ever imagined, but the principle was the same. You don't let it take over your land. My grandfather, a man who believed in practicality above all else, had a saying, "You can't fight what you can't see." I was going to make this thing visible. I spent the day in a state of feverish activity, driven by a cold, hard anger that was finally beginning to push back against the fear. I went into the barn and found every bag of flour and fine limestone powder I had. I spent hours walking the perimeter of the farmhouse, the barns, the sheds, laying down a thick white line of dust on the damp ground. If it crossed that line, it would leave a mark. It would show itself. Then I went to the workshop and found every bear trap my father had left behind. They were old, rusty things, brutally effective. I painstakingly cleaned and oiled them, the sharp snap of them closing echoing the tight tension in my own nerves. After dark, under the eerie glow of the security lights that now seemed pitifully inadequate, I set them. I placed them in strategic, unseen locations just outside the line of dust, by the tree line, near the path to the creek, in the shadow of the old silo. Sarah watched me from the kitchen window, her face a mask of worry. She didn't ask what I was doing. I think she was too afraid to know the answer. That night I didn't sit in the chair. I took up a position on the landing of the stairs, a perfect vantage point with a clear view of both the front and back doors. The rifle was loaded. A box of extra shells sat beside me. The house was dark, silent. The fog hadn't lifted, pressing against the windows like a living thing. And I waited. The hours ticked by. 1 o'clock. 2. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart. I was starting to feel the heavy pull of exhaustion. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness. Maybe it wouldn't come. Maybe leaving the metal was the end of it. Maybe... Snap. The sound was explosive in the dead of night. A sharp metallic crack that ripped through the silence, followed instantly by a sound I will never ever forget. It wasn't a roar of anger or a cry of pain from an animal. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated surprise. A loud, guttural, airy gasp like a massive lung being instantly emptied. It was so close, just outside the back of the house. I was on my feet in a second, rifle raised, my whole body trembling with adrenaline. The sound had come from the direction of the old well, not 20 yards from the kitchen door. The trap. I had gotten it. I flew down the stairs and to the back window, peering through the curtains. The security light cast a pool of stark, white light on the damp ground. The line of flour I'd laid was disturbed. A huge, shapeless smudge marred the perfect white line, and just beyond it, I could see the bear trap, sprung shut. But it was empty. It had snapped shut on nothing. And then my eyes adjusted. There was something. A thick, viscous liquid was spattered across the grass and the stones of the well, glistening black in the floodlight. And floating in the air, right above the empty trap, was a shimmering, wavering distortion. It was like heat haze rising from a summer road, but it was coalescing, taking shape, its outline becoming clearer and more defined as I watched. It was finally showing itself. And it was big, so much bigger than I ever could have imagined. My mind struggled to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. The air itself seemed to be bleeding. The shimmering distortion solidified, its edges sharpening from a vague heat haze mirage into a definite silhouette against the stark security light. It was impossibly tall, easily 9 or 10 feet, and painfully thin, like a figure drawn by a starving artist. Its limbs were long and spindly, bending at angles that felt wrong, unnatural. There was no color to it, not in the way we understand color. It was more like a pocket of void, a rip in the fabric of the night that swallowed the light around it. The black liquid I'd seen spattered on the ground was dripping from a spot near the bottom of its form, where its leg, if you could call it that, should have been caught in the trap's iron jaws. The guttural gasp it had made was replaced by a low vibrating hum that I felt in my teeth and bones more than I heard with my ears. It was a sound of pure malevolence, of ancient anger. It slowly turned its upper body, and I saw 2 points of faint crimson light ignite in the space where a head should be. They weren't eyes. They were embers, burning with a cold, intelligent fire, and they were fixed directly on the house, directly on me. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. You can't fight what you can't see. Well, now I could see it. And it was more terrifying than anything my imagination could have conjured. But the fear was being burned away by a cold, hard rage. This thing had terrorized my family. It had invaded my home. It had stood over me in my own field. This was my land. I raised the rifle, the stock firm against my shoulder, the crosshairs of the scope wavering as I tried to steady my breathing. I centered the glowing red embers in my sight. The report of the 3006 was deafening inside the enclosed space of the kitchen. The window pane shattered, spraying glass inwards. Outside, the creature staggered back, the humming sound rising in pitch to a shriek that scraped at the inside of my skull. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of outrage, of indignation. I hadn't hit it. I couldn't have missed at that range. The bullet must have passed right through it, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. It took a step towards the house, its unnatural leg dragging slightly, leaving a trail of the black, viscous fluid on the grass. The fluid sizzled and smoked where it touched the earth, killing the grass instantly in blackened, withered patches. Panic surged. The rifle was useless. The locks were useless. It was coming. "Sarah, get in the cellar, now!" I screamed, my voice cracking. I could hear her frantic footsteps above me, then the sound of the heavy cellar door scraping open and slamming shut. Thank God, at least she would be safe. I chambered another round, more out of instinct than hope. The creature was at the back door now. The wood of the door began to splinter and groan, not from a blow, but as if it were being warped and unwound from the inside out. The deadbolt glowed cherry red for a second before melting and dripping onto the floor. The doorknob twisted by itself, the mechanism inside screaming as it was forced, and then the door swung inward with a mournful creak. It stood there, framed in the doorway, a towering silhouette of wrongness. The two red embers of its eyes scanned the room before locking onto me. The low hum vibrated through the floorboards. I was going to die, right here in my own kitchen. A strange calm washed over me. I wasn't going to die cowering. I lowered the rifle. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Why are you here?" It took another step into the room, its form seeming to bend the light around it. The air grew cold, and the smell of ozone and burnt sugar filled the kitchen. It didn't answer with words. Instead, an image flooded my mind, overwhelming my senses. It wasn't a memory. It was a feeling, an experience. I felt the earth, not as a farmer, but as the earth itself. I felt the deep, slow turning of the planet, the pull of the moon, the ancient rhythms of stone and soil. And I felt a pain, a sharp, piercing agony, like a nail being driven into a living nerve. It was a deep, profane wrongness that had been festering for generations. And I knew what it was. The old well. The one it had been standing by when the trap snapped. My great-grandfather had sunk that well over a century ago. But when he hit the water table, the story went, the water was black and foul, unusable. He'd capped it with a huge slab of granite and dug a new well on the other side of the property. For 100 years it had just been a feature of the farm. A stone circle we mowed around. The image in my head sharpened. I saw my great-grandfather, a stern, bearded man from old photographs, dropping something into the well before he sealed it. Something heavy, wrapped in oilcloth and chains. The creature was a guardian, a warden. It hadn't been stalking me. It had been drawn by me. My presence, my family's presence, was a constant reminder of the cage, the seal that had been placed, the footprints, the tour of the farm, leaving my father's medal. It wasn't a threat. It was communication. It was trying to show me something, to point me to the source of the agony. It had been trapped, tethered to this place, and whatever my great-grandfather had buried was the anchor. "The well," I whispered, the realization dawning. The red embers in its head brightened, the humming sound lessening ever so slightly. It took a step back, out of the doorway, a gesture of patience? An invitation? I understood. My fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but my purpose was now clear. I laid the rifle on the kitchen table. Slowly I walked towards the open door and out into the cold, damp night. The creature retreated further, keeping a distance, its shimmering form a terrifying but patient sentinel in the darkness. I went to the barn and got the heavy pry bars and the sledgehammer. The granite slab capping the well was immense, sealed with ancient, crumbling mortar. It took me the better part of an hour of grueling, desperate work, my muscles screaming in protest. The creature just watched, silent, its humming a constant low thrum in the background. Finally, with a great groaning scrape, the slab shifted. I forced the pry bar underneath, and with a final agonizing heave, flipped it over. A wave of cold, foul air washed over me, a stench of stagnant water and decay so potent it made me gag. I shone my flashlight into the dark opening. The well was deep, its stone walls slick with black slime, and at the bottom, submerged in a few feet of brackish, oily water, was a dark shape, wrapped in the rotting remains of chains. Using a long pole with a hook, I managed to snag the chains and haul the object up. It was heavy, a dead weight that fought me the whole way. Finally, I dragged it onto the grass. It was a lead-lined box, pitted and corroded with age. Whatever was inside was the source of this century-long agony. I didn't need to open it. I knew, with an instinct that went deeper than thought, that its power had to be undone, not just moved. In the barn, my grandfather had kept a small forge for tool-making. Fired by a desperate certainty, I worked through the dawn, heating the forge, hotter than I ever had before. When the coals were white-hot, I placed the lead box into the heart of the fire. The creature stood at the edge of the barn's wide-open door, watching. As the lead began to melt and slump, a high, keening wail erupted from the box, a sound of pure despair that echoed the warden's own shriek. A plume of sick, greenish-black smoke boiled into the air, and for a moment I saw writhing, spectral shapes within it before the morning breeze tore it apart and carried it away. When the last of the box had melted into a slag of glowing metal, a profound silence fell over the farm. The low hum I'd grown accustomed to was gone. I turned and looked at the creature. It stood there for a long moment, its shimmering form seeming less dense, more translucent. The red embers in its head faded, like dying coals. It raised one of its long, spindly arms in a gesture that felt impossibly ancient, a gesture of thanks, of release. Then it simply dissolved, not vanishing in a puff of smoke, but fading, like a watercolor painting in the rain, until there was nothing left but the clean morning air. The sun broke through the fog, bathing the farm in a warm, golden light. The birds began to sing, a chorus of celebration. The cattle in the pasture let out a low, contented moo and began to graze peacefully. The land felt quiet, truly quiet. The oppressive, watchful feeling was gone, and my farm was mine again. I walked back to the house, exhausted beyond measure, but at peace. Sarah came out the door, her face pale, and wrapped her arms around me. She didn't ask what had happened, she just held me. I knew I would never be able to fully explain it, but as I stood there, holding my wife in the morning sun, I looked out over the fields that my family had worked for generations, and I understood. We aren't just owners of the land, we're its caretakers. And sometimes that means dealing with problems much, much older than a broken fence.